I'm Gail Presby from University of Detroit Mercy, and I am just one of the 4 universities of Mercy Peace Forum who puts on these events. And we're so glad that you could join with us. And Mike Clinton is also here. He'll be a co-host with me, helping me with in case I need to find the controls and he can find them better than I can. So thanks so much for joining us and for this important event. And we are going to have the event set up so that you will be able to chat with us. If you have any question, please chat to hosts and panelists. And when we're closer to the end, you'll have a chance to raise your hand if you want to verbally ask your question. And so with that as a background, let me just say the other universities that we have. We have 4 Mercy universities and the Peace History Society as co-sponsors of this event. We've been doing an event once per semester. And we are very happy just now, tonight, to have Claire Schaeffer-Duffy. And she's a journalist with the National Catholic Reporter. She's a longtime Catholic worker. Claire, I think we've known each other since the early 80s. So I know you've been a stalwart of peace movement for a long time. A co-founder of the St. Francis and Therese Catholic Worker in Worcester, Massachusetts. And she's going to share her reflections on the importance of nonviolent action in our world today, especially focusing on some of her recent work with her visit to Ukraine, where she was reporting on the movement to nonviolently defend the Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant. So, but how we will do this, because this is how the Mercy Peace Forum have been going, is I'll be asking you a few questions about your development as a peace activist. And then at that point, I will then ask you to get to your main topic. But just so that we all get to know each other, I wanted to ask you a first background question. Tell us who you are and what is your work at the Catholic Worker House that you founded, and tell us about your second job as a journalist.
Good evening, everybody. I'm happy to be with you, and I know the technology is a little daunting for people in my age bracket, but I'm glad we can get together through this technology. So, as Gail said, I'm Claire Schaeffer-Duffy, and I'm a founding member, not one among many, of the St. Francis and Therese Catholic Worker, which is a small lay community located in Worcester, Massachusetts. And we established in 1987. We offer hospitality to men and women in need. We publish mostly through the good and consistent energy of my husband, Scott Schaeffer-Duffy, a journal of opinion every 2 months called The Catholic Radical. We do a lot of peace and justice work. We began as a young couple very much on nuclear disarmament, because in the early 1980s, that was the big focus for many people. And I should back the story up a little bit and say that I entered the Catholic Worker movement through my studies at the University of Virginia. I was a political and social thought major, was one of the early interdisciplinary majors, And it meant that I had to do some reading in political philosophy and social theory. And I also had to write a senior thesis. And I was a huge procrastinator. I still am, especially when it comes to writing, and found myself frantically looking for the thesis topic at the library at the university, and came across a book called A Harsh and Dreadful Love. And it was William Miller's biography about Dorothy Day, one of the early biographies about her. She had died only in 1980. And the preface of the book really touched me. It was a description of the Catholic Worker movement, and I was intrigued that this was a movement centered on a political and social engagement, but coming from a faith tradition. I was raised Methodist and was evangelical for a little while, and in college had become involved with a shelter that really kind of opened up my consciousness to human suffering, and was always saw my faith as a reference point for an inspiration, kind of almost like the guiding vibe in my life for responding to reality. So I was moved that here was a movement that was not preaching an individual salvation, but very interested in the movement of God in the world, especially among the poor. So I wrote my thesis, and that led me to go to a Catholic worker house in Washington, D.C. And this was in 1982. It was the era of Reaganomics. There were 2,000 homeless people on the streets of Washington, D.C., and there was a network of community activism, also a very vibrant network. One of the most creative was the Community for Creative Nonviolence that was led by a charismatic man named Mitch Schneider. And he was challenging the individualism, the selfishness of Reaganomics with a lot of creative nonviolent actions. I remember one in which the activists dressed up as fat cats, like, big guys from the corporate world. And they created this enormous pie filled with whipped cream and brought it to the grounds of the Capitol and had this big spiel about everybody wants a piece of the pie. And they all sort of jumped into the whipped cream to do a kind of mock representation of corporate greed, because there was no piece of the pie left for anybody but the fat cats. So I had early exposure to nonviolent activism through the Catholic worker movement, particularly around nuclear disarmament and the wars in Central America. And then I went on to become a mother. We have 4 children. I'm a grandmother of 6 now, which is crazy. But that experience also was profound in terms of deepening my engagement with the world, because it's not just the world that I inhabit, but that the next generation inhabits, namely my children, and a few are 20-year-old students that you inhabit, because my children are older than 20. So this consciousness that I'm part of a chain of humanity, and what in my tiny way can I contribute. And my motherhood really motivated me to have a world that was more a place where children can thrive rather than just barely, live. I did not become involved in journalism until my children were older, and it was kind of, I stumbled into it. I had been writing for the Catholic Radical, but I had an occasion to join a women's peace delegation to Bosnia in the late 1980s. And that experience was very revealing, because I was in a war zone, not looking at the structural violence of nuclear weapons, but actually interviewing people who had survived a very bloody and terrible war amongst themselves. This was the Bosnian War, concluded in 1995. It resulted in the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. It also resulted in a deep fissure of trust among people who had once lived as neighbors. And because in the former Yugoslavia, it was a mixed community in terms of Serbs, Bosnians, people of different religious affiliation, who just shared life together in, very ordinary ways. And suddenly the war imposed an identity on them, and really devastated their cities, devastated their towns, devastated their sense of who they had been, who they could be. It was a very intimate war, and that educated me. I was doing interviews and began to write about them, and was recommended for the National Catholic Reporters. So the kind editor there took a risk and let me try a story or two. And I don't want to overstate my case. I am an occasional contributor, less so in recent years, to the publication. But it was in the status of reporter that I got to go to different countries, Afghanistan, Burundi, Haiti a couple of times, and to mostly to conflict zones. I was in India observing a development struggle, a campaign, nonviolent campaign against the the damming of a river. But the marvel of being a journalist, I'd say that profession, perhaps, and someone said being a priest, are sort of two professions, maybe doctor, where people will open up to you. They just tell you their story. They want to tell you about their life, and you're a complete stranger. You have walked in to the scene, and they will talk. And that if you're someone like myself who finds human beings just endlessly fascinating, it's a privilege to sit and listen. And it's daunting to try to get the story right, understand what they're saying, but I think it feeds this characteristic of peacemaking, which is to really cross lines and meet the other. So that's a very long answer. I don't know if that was too long. You might need a bell to clock me.
Oh, no, that's fine. In fact, you mentioned all these places around the world you've been, but I have to say you also came here to Detroit to write a story, didn't you?
Yes, I did. And I loved Detroit. I loved seeing Detroit. It was so interesting to me.
Right. A story on the sisters, the nuns here working for water rights, was that?
Yes. It was looking at the struggle around the water shutoffs that were happening in the city. And there were some very committed nuns who were standing with people that were affected by the water shutoffs, and they really helped me to connect with that struggle and story. So
yes,
I really loved being in Detroit, I should say.
Good. And I wanted to say I can really relate to how precious it is when somebody opens up and tells you their story. And being in peace history, as some of us are, that's another opportunity when you're trying to get the story, what happened, and you find the people who were part of it, and you get to talk to them and interview. So anyway, maybe I have a little idea too of what you're describing, and in journalism, by being an academic who's involved in oral histories. So now I wanted to ask you just one more background question before we go to contemporary times. Do you have like a guiding principle or goal? How do you decide which of the many issues facing the world that you want to get involved in? And do you have inspirations of particular persons or quotes or books or movements? How have you decided, make the decisions about what you are going to devote your life to?
I am a person who has always struggled with what to prioritize. Even at 63, I very much struggle. I feel continually like I'm a woman driving 6 white horses, not one. And having said that, prayer helps give comfort to that dis-ease that I will feel when I'm overwhelmed with lots of possibilities. So I will sometimes just put the concerns, not sometimes, quite often, to prayer. So that's one aspect. In writing, when I look back at, to give you an example, I was in September of 2015, I was driving in the car, and I overheard about the brutal killing of 3 Italian nuns at a mission in Bujumbura, which is the capital of this tiny country of Burundi. And I was, shocked. The press stories about it described that even for Burundi, where there have been a lot of extrajudicial killings, where there has been wars between Tutsi and Hutu, that this was a kind of stunning murder, because the 3 women were killed in their compound. They were well loved in the community. They were not strangers. So I remember feeling, well, this needs to be investigated for their sake, for the sake of these women. You can't just kill human beings and not have people ask a lot of questions, especially people who give their lives to God and or to the service of others. It's not every life lost is terrible, but this was not a mafia killing, where you could say that there are criminal variables here that maybe influenced the murder. So that made me think of wanting to go and investigate this murder, who did it. And I have never been to Central Africa, so I was told this would be a really daunting thing to do. And I prayed to Saint Therese, and I said, well, if you want me to do it, let me see roses. And I did see roses. So I did that trip. So in that case, it was a combination of kind of my own astonishment, gut reaction, prayer, and capacity, because I did have some capacity. In a general direction, I do continually feel a call to work for an end to war. And I feel self-conscious even saying that, because that is such a vast task, and one one that won't be realized. It's not like saying, I feel called to build this bridge, literal bridge, like I can see how you do it from, and I have to remind myself that I've failed at my calling miserably, because we're in a time of endless war. It's not like, any of us have ended war making. In fact, it seems to be accelerating. But I'm influenced by a quote from Dan Berrigan that I will paraphrase poorly, but he basically says, how can we not say something? So to be fully human for me in this moment is to speak out about the killing that's happening in Gaza. Why? Because I'm an American woman, and it is my government that is paying and creating the bombs and blocking the appeals for ceasefire. So to be, and because I am familiar with the occupied territories, I have been there several times, not to Gaza, but I've been to Israel, Palestine twice, and I am receiving texts from our friend in Bethlehem. And so for me, as challenging as it is to be open to that work, how can I not? Because we are all one. So when one is suffering, we are all suffering. And so the how to respond is often the area that it leaves me struggling. Like, can I respond with prayer? Do I respond with organizing, activism? Do I respond with writing? This requires discernment that I'm not always good at.
Okay. Well, thanks for that background. And so now, given that you say you sometimes struggle with this, we nevertheless want to hear the story of how you decided how and why you went to Ukraine in the middle of a war as part of this project. We'd really like to learn more about the project, as well as to learn about why you decided to go and who you met and what you found out about this project of nonviolent defense of the Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant when you went to Ukraine. We'd like to hear about it.
Sure. So when the war in Ukraine broke out, which it was brought to American consciousness, popular consciousness, I'll say, in February of 2022, which is when Russia, crossed into Ukraine and invaded. So that's when anybody in the peace movement, their eyes suddenly turned to Ukraine. Some people had been very aware of that conflict, which if you go to Ukraine, they will tell you the war did not begin in 2022. It began in 2014. But for my own understanding, I didn't become attentive until February of 2022. And it was very devastating to think that we had just pulled out of Afghanistan in August of the preceding year, and we could not go a year as a country without a military supporting a conflict militarily, through weaponry and money for weaponry. So there was a real period of just devastation and feeling very down and meeting with other people and what can be done. And I was aware that there were faith groups. It's important for people to know that even after the wars, after the war's incursion, there were appeals for ceasefire, as there are now in Gaza. There was in the spring of 2022, a delegation of faith leaders went to Kyiv. Prior to that, a peacemaking community called Sant'Egidio had made a specific request for the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, because it's the heartland of Orthodoxy, both Russian and Ukrainian. And so can this city of churches be at least a place of peace? I was aware of these initiatives and had, through them, hosted for the Center for Nonviolent Solutions a talk on Ukraine that was led by one of the a member of the Franciscan Action Network, Michelle Dunn. She's executive director. She had gone on the interfaith delegation to Kyiv in May of 2022. And she was very self-conscious about speaking on the conflict. She said, I'm not an expert, and you really should talk to, I'm not even as familiar on peacemaking initiatives as a gentleman named Dr. John Ruhr, who was in Ukraine in the autumn of 2022, looking for nonviolent initiatives that he could support and help cultivate. So Dr. Ruhr is a man of retired emergency room physician with a long history of working on peace teams, and specifically in the field of unarmed civilian protection. And this strategy in nonviolence dates back to, I'm going to say the wars in Central America, but Gail, you can correct me, even earlier. But during those wars, internationals began experimenting with tactics called interpositioning, where you bring internationals literally to a conflict zone and hope that their presence will be de-escalating, or through what was called accompaniment. There was a very well-known organization, Peace Brigades International, that on a small scale would bring together internationals to provide 24/7 accompaniment to labor leaders and human rights leaders in Central America who were targeted for assassination because of their political work, because of their work for justice. So these were efforts that were experimental, but in the case of Peace Brigades International, quite a few of them were very effective. They actually did protect people because they kept eyes on, the state of the person. Fast forward, Nonviolent Peace Force, which was founded by Mel Duncan and David Hartzog, began to take this idea of unarmed civilian protection and ask, can this be a peacekeeping method that is non-military? So the United Nations has a peacekeeping force, many of you may be aware of it, that engages armies from countries around the world. But if you are part of the UN peacekeeping force, you wear the blue helmets, you are given weaponry, but your mandate is very, very minimal military engagement. Typically, you're there to be an international presence during times of conflict, with the hopes that you will de-escalate or prevent further escalation. So could that happen with unarmed civilian protectors? And Nonviolent Peace Force is the largest international organization in the world that's experimenting with this, and they are bringing in teams who work in conflict situations or post-conflict where the warring factions have signed a ceasefire agreement or peace treaty, but things are still very shaky, you know, and very volatile. So unarmed nonviolent peace force has come in to be a presence in those situations. And I'll give you an example. We had a presentation on this at the Center for Nonviolent Solutions where I work, but in one site where nonviolent peace force was working, there was a very big problem with women leaving refugee camps to collect water and firewood. And so the refugee camps were sort of a space of sanctuary for the community, but you have to survive, you have to go out and get the water, right? And you have to go get the firewood. But the women were very vulnerable in these essential trips, and some were getting raped by the opposing tribe that was still in the area. So this was brought to the efforts of the Nonviolent Peace Force team. And I should say that Nonviolent Peace Force really works on local development. So they try to find the voices in the community who are trusted, who are the leaders, who can identify what potential sources of conflict. So they provided these unarmed civilian protectors who wear clothing that's well, you know, marked like jerseys, so that they're identified to accompany these women, and the rapes dropped completely. They, you know, it went from like, I don't know, 60% of incidents to nothing because of this intervention. But this is an intervention without guns. So this is what John was looking for and thinking about in the context of Ukraine. And after being there for a while, I'm just going to pull up my slides. And this slideshow is too long for our purposes, so I'm just going to give you a couple of images, and then we can go back to the questioning. But let's see if, I guess I need to screen share. Do I do this? Let's see. Advanced. Okay, I want that portion of screen. Can everybody see this?
Not yet.
Okay. So what John came back from his autumn 2022 trip to Ukraine with this idea of engaging the technique of unarmed civilian protection for the Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant, which is located in southwestern Ukraine, and at that time, and still is, was on the war's front line. So here's a picture of the plant, and let me see now how I advance. Here
we can't see it yet, Claire.
Oh, you cannot see it.
No, but so
Okay.
when you share your screen, make sure you're choosing the right screen, or have it mirror your whole computer, however you want.
Okay. So I'm doing portion of screen share.
Because sometimes it.
Can you see it now?
Yes. Yes, okay. You do.
Okay, and then, all right. So I know it's a little bit cut off, but here's a photo of the power plant where you can see it's very large. It's the largest in Europe. And pre-war, it provided 1/5 of Ukraine's energy. This is an aerial view of it. So it's one of, you know, several one of, I think, 6 power plants in Ukraine. and located here along the Dnipro River. And you can see it's literally on the front lines of the war. And in March of 2022, yes, shortly after the Russians entered Ukraine, they seized control of the plant. And they did so after about 4 or 5 days of civilian resistance. So that the town of, this is an aerial view, but this town here, or city of Enerhodar, was built to house the plant, the workers at the nuclear power plant. And when the Russians were kind of coming in, from the south up to take the plant is right here in this area. The townspeople went out to meet the convoy of tanks and tried to dissuade them to turn around, not come in and take control of the nuclear power plant. The nuclear power plant had at that point only 80 or so National Guardsmen who were protecting it. And so the procession towards the tanks that happened for several days was also a stall tactic. Many citizens were trying to give the position of the tanks to the Ukrainian army. Others were throwing some Molotov cocktails. It wasn't exclusively nonviolent, but it was predominantly because people did not have weaponry and they were just resorting to appeal. And at that point in the war, the Russians didn't want to be seen as the brutal invaders. They wanted to be understood as liberators. So it contradicted the image for them to just barrel through. But eventually they did, and they seized control of the plant. For a long time, the plant kept its Ukrainian employees, but not all of them. And the status of this plant became a source of international concern because it is not only very large, but it has been running since the 90s and has an enormous amount of nuclear waste stored on site. So to be in the environs of a combat zone is very dangerous. If the nuclear power plant was struck, it could result in massive contamination, not only in Ukraine, but in parts of Europe and also in Russia. So it's September of, I'm going to fast forward ahead. Here are the photos of the fuel storage, which makes the plant especially vulnerable because it's not just producing energy, it's a storage site for spent fuel rods, and these have to be kept in water. And the water actually is a buffer for these rods that are vibrating with energy, and if they touch, it would be very explosive. A little bit of details on the power plant. It was in September of 2022 that the United Nations International Atomic Energy Agency finally was able, through the initiative of Rafael Grossi, able to get inspectors, international monitors into the plant. And that action really captivated John Ruhr, because we had been told, here's a site of bombing of the roof of one of the facilities. But I just want to see if I can get you a photo of Grossi. At that point in the war, in September of 2022, the hopes of ceasefire been abandoned. The war was becoming more hardened, you might say. And yet here was this individual, Rafael Grossi, who through negotiation skills met with Putin personally, met with Zelensky. He was one of the few people going between the two leaders, and he was able to persuade them to allow a team of international monitors to be at the plant to make sure that controls were still working and that risks were mitigated. It was a small team, but they had to come through, and they are unarmed. Nuclear power plant monitors are not soldiers. They're just civilians like you and I with high expertise. So they were coming unarmed through a combat zone to protect this nuclear power plant. And that really intrigued John. And so he began to wonder, this is the UN Secretary General talking about how dangerous the risks that the plant posed. So, and these are the inspectors, Grossi meeting with Zelensky and Putin and even the Pope. But John began to, think, well, here is an interesting opportunity for a nonviolent strategy, because there is no military option to protect the plant, because in fact, explosives near the plant are hazardous. And here were monitors unarmed coming in, doing, the technical review. What if thousands of people who were trained in unarmed civilian protection, because there was this legacy or this discipline already in play through Nonviolent Peace Force and through other peace teams, what if they amplified the efforts of the monitors, went in, provided unarmed accompaniment for them, or even helped to create a no-fire zone around the plant? So that's became the goal of the Zaporizhzhia Protection Project. It was to support and amplify the work of the IAEA inspectors to protect the large populations. And it was also to try to engage civil society members, ideally on both sides, to be involved in the protection of that plant on both sides of the war. So I spoke to you a little bit about unarmed civilian protection, which is often called UCP. It's very unique in the peace and human rights field because it is using nonviolent strategy in active war zone. A lot of nonviolent resistance happens farther from the field of combat, and this was trying to bring it more into an area of combat, which intrigued me. It also, I admit that I thought it's highly unlikely, because there is a energy that happens once a battle is going that's very hard to pull back. So in the spring of this year, I traveled with an exploratory team as a writer, of a team of 4 of us, to interview Ukrainians about the prospect of this project. Were they concerned about the safety of the plant? Were they familiar with UCP? Did they think unarmed civilian protection could augment its safety? So we landed in Kyiv. We spoke with the very important pacifist there. He's the kind of head of the Ukrainian pacifist movement, Yuri Shilizhenko, and also a young couple who's also interested in peace. And one could say they were the core of the peace movement in Kyiv, which is very small. But this is a capital under the siege of war. So finding peace voices is very difficult, but these were some of them. And we learned in our discussion with them that the Protestant churches were actually, some of them were pacifist, particularly I think the Jehovah's Witnesses, and that had influenced their pacifist stance or pacific stance during the war had influenced this young couple, particularly the wife. We traveled east toward the war zone, stopped in Dnipro, where we met a Protestant pastor and spoke about the project and learned about the city. And here's some shots of a city that was both in parts fully functioning, in other areas had suffered a bombardment. This was a strike that happened in January. Many of the women and children were no longer in Dnipro, who had lived there, but the city was receiving an influx of people coming from the east. They're called internally displaced people. If you leave, if let's say you left Detroit and went to Chicago because Detroit was under fire, you would be an internally displaced person, not a refugee. So this was a city filled with IDPs now, and the pastor was trying to care for them. He had worked at the front. So the challenge, as we were meeting people, is that the humanitarian needs that come up from the war, basically trying to get people food, medical supplies, some kind of pastoral care when they've had to flee their homes, was the overwhelming focus. So it was challenging to ask about a project like protecting a nuclear power plant. We moved into Zaporizhzhia, which was closer to the plant itself. There's a city named Zaporizhzhia, and stayed at the Hotel Teatralny, where we conducted a number of interviews. I don't have photos of those we interviewed because of their concern about security, but here were two local journalists, a radio journalist and a print and a media journalist, that gave us a lot of their time. And also a wonderful Catholic nun, Sister Lucia Murashko, who connected us with people that had once lived in the environs of the plant. Here's a scene of the civilian resistance that had happened in March of 2022, a year before our arrival, that were trying to stop the tanks from coming in. And more on that. I will close out, because I know this is not to consume the evening, but our project was just collecting a sense of what people thought was possible on the ground, and a second team went just this September. And it was very difficult to construct a nonviolent team under the current conditions, because what happens in war is the people become very, very embittered. And to do unarmed civilian protection, you need to build an enormous amount of trust. And people, the Ukrainian society, while they have a strong network of volunteers, it was difficult for them to imagine civilians having a role in their own protection, that they saw the military as taking that function entirely. So I was not on the second team. They also did a number of interviews and tried to connect with environmental organizations, and also some women's groups that are watching nuclear power. So all of the environmental climate concerns that we as Americans have in our country, just namely with the nuclear power plant, for example, in Massachusetts, that is closing down, where are they going to put the wastewater? So that's a huge discussion in Cape Cod area, because people are not wanting contaminated water coming into the Cape Cod Bay. So the nuclear power plant in itself is a volatile source of energy, even in peace times. Layer on top of that a war, and you have big challenge. But I think even in these small efforts, the building of relationships with organizations, civil society organizations that are working on these was very, very important. So more to say on that, but I'm concerned I'm going on too long. So.
Well, Claire, I mean, you've been telling us some really important information. So, but I mean, you are right, the time is going on, and I know we do have people here with us, and yes. Those folks may have questions. I know I have a few questions, but before I turn to any of my questions, this might be a good opportunity for us to see if those who have joined us have questions. And I think, looks to me like Dorothy Ritter has her hand up. Dorothy, do you want to ask a question? Or is that an accident that your hand is up? Dorothy, oh, here she comes.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I might have done that by accident, but since I've been called on, I was thinking, and thank you very much for your presentation. It's been wonderful. I guess one of the thoughts that I had early on when you were explaining your discernment process, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about that. I was intrigued by the way you talked about so many issues, and they speak to your heart. But how is the process for you to know which one and at what time to place your heart and your love and your energies with so much going on in the world today? Thank you.
Well, it's an ongoing question for me, and I will repeat, I am not good at limiting or discerning, and especially now with so much going on. On the Zaporizhzhia Protection Project, I had experienced a lot of sorrow about the eruption of another war. And then that leads me invariably to want to sit with people who are trying to respond and do something about it. And I think, I'm so sorry, you all, I can't see the faces on the screen for some reason in this format, but for any of you who are still, in the room and listening, when we're assaulted with so much destruction as we are at this point in time, and because of different wars, it's very important to get together with other people and not go through this alone. I can't stress enough, I don't think God made us relational, and we can be together in our grief, we can be together in our processing what is difficult, but also together in our creative action. So war happens, I feel grief, I feel devastated, I look for people who are doing something, because this gives me comfort, but more than that, it reminds me that in as much as people destroy things, people are also just amazing in their efforts to save life, protect life, and this is the Holy Spirit. So for me, this is God afoot in the world. So I gravitate to those people, and it is in those sessions, those meetings, that I learn about initiatives that interest me. And this one, while I'll be candid with you, the effort to apply unarmed civilian protection in an area where people are engaged in, combat
Yes.
is really a stretch. That's putting it diplomatically. It's really a stretch. However, let's think about our peacemaking the way the weapons builders think. They get experimental. They try things. They don't work. And when it doesn't work for them, or the consequences are huge. And battle plans are experimental. Battle plans are, people will try something, a general will make a call, do this, do that, and sometimes it's victorious, if we want to use that word, but a lot of times it's disastrous. And I think in our peacemaking, we need to be innovative, because we are in a lineage. And okay, you did unarmed civilian protection for these labor leaders, these human rights in 1980s. Now that's expanded. Now that's, expanded to go into conflict zones post, peace treaty or post ceasefire. Now it's being attempted here. The shape changes, but that innovation is very important. Peacemaking, peace building is not static. It is not static, and it needs to adapt and be responsive. So I was curious how it might be, how it might unfold here. And I was also made aware that of the hazards that nuclear power plants pose, which is a very important awareness, because we are in a time of trying to reconfigure our energy systems, and there's a lot of advocacy for nuclear power, but nuclear power in a world where battles happen is very risky. It's not just that they're risky because of the material that they contain in peace times. Ukraine is very vulnerable because of that plant. So I don't know if that answers your question. It's kind of
Yes.
brief, gathering, learning,
Yes.
keeping a sense that we need to be innovative, and that God is with us, and that we must try. And also, I don't want to misrepresent that this is a gloomy journey, because you get to meet some wonderful people. Wonderful. When I sat in on the Zaporizhzhia Protection Project, these were Americans mostly, but internationals too, who were meeting like every 2 weeks. And many of them had worked in very high conflict areas like Iraq. They had been on peace teams in Iraq. One told a story, a mild-mannered farmer from the Midwest, of being kind of briefly held hostage by 2 Iraqi militants that wanted to steal their phones and computers. And because they kept calm, because the peace team people had de-escalation techniques, they were all right. It could have ended disastrously, but he told the story of, in the context of, yes, this will put you in places of risks, and yes, it's good to know how to de-escalate the circumstance.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dorothy. And for the rest of you, remember, you can either raise your hand if you want to ask your question in person, or you can chat to us and I will read your question on your behalf. So we'd really like to hear from you. Carol would like now to ask you a question. Carol, go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. it's not exactly a question, it's a comment on, this is not exactly nonviolent peacemaking, but it is. I was a former Peace Corps volunteer. I have a Peace Corps friend from this area in Detroit who served in Ukraine. And she has many, many contacts there. And she has been working hard to bring medical supplies, hospital equipment, food, and clothing to the people in Ukraine. I mean, it's certainly an effort of peace, even though you're not getting together with Putin and the opponents and so forth. And because of her contacts, she's able to do this. Somehow she's able to get her materials from here to Canada, from Canada to Poland, and from Poland into Ukraine. And she has sent me pictures of the people receiving bread, the oil, the different things that the different things that they are needing to survive, including areas in villages that are normally do not receive the kind of aid that's being given by other countries around the world who are trying to help with humanitarian efforts. So I just thought I would mention that she's very active still here in Detroit. She's importing the art of artists there in Ukraine who are professionals, just as and they some of their art is about the war, and she's doing all her can. I just thought I would mention that right now, and if she's available for speaking if ever she's needed. Okay, thank you for listening.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Okay, we have a question about what's the same approach of I presume of the nonviolent defense done with Chernobyl, or was it only with Zaporizhzhia?
No, because the Chernobyl plant is shut down and encased. The accident that happened there that was so catastrophic was connected to human error. And one of the reasons that locals were confident that the Zaporizhzhia power plant would be all right in this occasion of war is because they believed that the building of the plant had been improved, that it was much better fortified. But the tragedy with Chernobyl is that while the plant is encased, the environment, like the region around it, cannot be inhabited by human beings, a large swath of the land. And Dr. Ruhr was saying that when the Russians crossed, because Chernobyl is on the northern border of Ukraine, when Russian troops came through in that region, those segments of, or units of troops, they were camping on contaminated territory, and he just thought that was a really, another example of war treating soldiers like they're just fodder, and not considering them as human beings.
Okay, Robin had a follow-up saying, I thought they used Chernobyl as a threat. I don't know what that means exactly, but the Russians, she says.
I'm not aware of that, Robin. It's my understanding that
Rachel.
Rachel, sorry.
I wanted to ask you wait, Rachel's gonna clarify herself what she meant. Okay, Rachel, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. It was stated that even though it was encased, that the Russians were threatening on bombing Chernobyl to contaminate the area and use that in part of their warfare, which is why I asked, even though it's encased, did they have access to that at all to release that into the environment? See, that I thought they had it armed, Chernobyl. They had armed guards around there. Ukrainians did.
Yes, I know that there was fighting at some fighting at Chernobyl, and actually that people were killed, and I think there might have even been some torture, but it's still, to my knowledge, under Ukrainian control. It's not under Russian control like Zaporizhzhia is. So but I could be wrong. That's my understanding. I think in the early days of the war, it was contested territory, yes. But I think the Ukrainians still control that area.
Okay.
Is that your understanding, Rachel, or are you asking if yeah? Go ahead.
Yeah, and can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I wasn't sure. I heard for a brevity that Ukraine did regain control of Chernobyl, but what you were saying, that they were camping on the grounds around there, that wasn't announced here, publicly. How it was said was the Russians were taking control of Chernobyl, and that it's a grave threat to the area and to, our environment should they release the waste, because there's mass amounts of waste there.
Mm-hmm.
And then we heard that Ukrainians then regained control of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was curious if you guys used the peacekeeping method, the unarmed peacekeeping, to do that, or there was a
no, because I think by the time that John was looking at the Zaporizhzhia Protection Project, which was this year, implementation this year, he conceived the idea in December of 2022, but there were training sessions or meetings about the project for every 2 weeks for months before even the April trip. So at that juncture, the Ukraine had control of the Chernobyl area. So
okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Those are all great questions. But it does remind me that the nuclear power plant is a resource war, because Russian keeping control, because then they have access to it and critical energy supply. So that also complicates any peacemaking initiative. I don't know, have any students here studied negotiation skills? What do you have to think about when you do negotiations? Anybody want to risk an answer to that question?
I can guess, but anyone else? Well, Rachel has an idea.
Well, I would have to think about their culture and how they use words. Sometimes words are used in its first meaning or second meaning, depending on the culture. And so I'd have to think about that. And I think it would require a lot of listening to understand truly what their goals are, right? And then I would have to express my goals very clearly. And then, I would take steps at both parties to reach a portion of each goal that gets us closer to the goal. I wouldn't expect the goal to be adhered to in empowerment and immediate succession of my goal without, giving some kind of incentive back to the person I'm negotiating with. So I think that's important. And then I think it's important to insert human element, the human nature and element of anything that's or intangible. I think it's most important that, we look at that human compass and that human morale. That's how I would start it.
Anyone else on negotiation? What are you thinking? That was wonderful, Rachel. Thank you. That was very thorough. Anyone else? What would people who are working on negotiation be thinking about? It's relative to this, why this situation is so difficult.
Okay, you might have to tell us, Claire.
Yes, I thought I heard someone in the background there. In the language of negotiation, you're thinking about interests. So what is party A's interest? What is party B's interest? I heard a wonderful negotiator give a presentation for kids, and he was saying he was stuck, trying to get to some kind of compromise with the person across the table from him. And finally, he just asked the most direct question, which is, what is it that you really want? And so here, the interest of the Russians is control of the plant, because it's a power currency, right? I've got an energy resource, and that's a very strong leverage. I can use the energy for my people. I can deprive the other side of electricity, and so that's good. I've got an energy resource. And maybe the interest of the other side, of course, they want that resource back, but it would be not to have that. The other side would okay, we want that energy source too, but a common interest of both parties would be, well, we can't have this thing dissolve on us because it's going to affect everybody. So in negotiation, you're trying to find that common interest. And that's what gave John a certain degree of optimism that a kind of unarmed process could work here, because there was already agreement, if you talk to the Russians, if you talk to the Ukrainians, that definitely the plant cannot implode. That was a common interest for both sides, because that would screw up everybody. And that's not easy to realize in a negotiation. A lot of negotiations, it's very hard to find what's the common thing.
I wanted to ask you a question, because you talked about the efforts to recreate this nonviolent group to protect the plant. But you also mentioned that seemingly spontaneously, maybe it wasn't spontaneous, just the year before, there were thousands of people who gathered. Were you able to find out more about how they did it the first time? Were there churches organizing it, or other associations? Were Ukrainians drawing on previous experience of nonviolent action that gave them both the idea of what they wanted to do and the skills of how they did it? So did you have a chance to talk to anyone about that?
Well, I didn't explore that question deeply, but John Ruhr did on the second trip. And so he did a lot of interviews, or tried to, with the residents of Enerhodar, who were from the city that had the civilian resistance against the incoming Russian tanks. And what I can gather from what he said is that they did have kind of the charismatic guidance of, I believe, the mayor and deputy mayor. So he was somebody that had the capacity to rally people. And the city was not unified. There were some who were not opposed as strongly as others to the Russians coming in, because this is a region where 90% of the people speak Russian. But I think that there was a strong group or hub for whom they wanted to plant the Ukrainian flag, kind of metaphorically, in the ground. This city will remain Ukrainian. They were deeply invested. This was their hometown. So you can imagine, I don't know, in Detroit, who are your adjacent or nearby rivals? Let's say the Canadians came in from across the river, and they were a convoy, and they were wanting to say that now Detroit, or some of your resources in Detroit, are Canadian. People who have strong allegiance to Detroit as an American city. They have their homes here. They have had their livelihoods here. They are motivated to stop that change. So the deputy mayor had that. But the appeals that were made did use the churches in some instances. Those were points of organizing, but that kind of worked both ways, because some of the churches, the churches in Ukraine are Russian Orthodox. So one story told by the Ukrainian Orthodox pastor, because the war has kind of brought a split, is that some of the priests were coming out with the icons on the banners, and it was an ambiguous symbol. Was this a welcome to the troops, or was this we are here with the people as priests? He said it was ambiguous what they were communicating.
Do you have any update about what's going on with Yuri and the movement of those who are conscientious objectors in Ukraine?
Yes, actually, I do, because that's another area when one thinks about where are the spaces in an active war that you can make peace. The nuclear power plant was one space that people attempted. There are other spaces, but this war has had a remarkable number of people refuse to fight, especially on the Russian side. And it grieved me that there was no infrastructure to support them. And that, in fact, some who had been brought to who had come to the United States via the southern border were actually ensnared in our detention system, which is terrible. And some were dragged on planes and deported back to Russia, where they would face very ominous consequences. The European peace movement has tried to energize the Office for Conscientious Objectors has tried to energize efforts to make the EU include the right to conscientious objection as part of their legal framework, like we have in the United States. But in the United States, the Center for Conscience and War has organized on December 11th a panel with attorneys that are working specifically with Russian refusers and what the legal possibilities are. It's very brutal. I just to share with you all here, to let you know how thorough the war-making system is. Here you have men, mostly young men with a whole life before them, who say, all right, we agree. We think the Russian war against Ukraine is not a good thing. We don't want to fight it. We're going to walk out. We're going to leave. We're going to, give up a lot. And the U.S. won't support them, the U.S. government, because the cynicism is, well, if we as a government officially, formally support your draft dodgers, then should we ever get the draft, you won't give us back our guys and our women when they leave the country. So it's a very brutal system, that makes it hard for people to live out from a space of conscience.
Oh, gee. Oh, that's hard. Well, let me ask you one last question, which is, so you are a journalist and you are still writing, and you are covering these nonviolent attempts. Do you see your work as a journalist? Are you helping them to be remembered, or are you also working to make them better known as they are happening? So are you a recorder, or are you a publicizer, or just how do you see your role in something like this, an unfolding and ongoing work in Ukraine in the midst of war?
Well, again, a confession, I've done very little writing. I mean, I've done writing, but I've actually done writing on poetry, and now I'm trying to do some fiction for class. But when I do write, I guess I see the purpose is to inform people that these nonviolent initiatives are happening. I don't think we have enough information about that. And I guess that is my primary purpose, because you can we need to know that in as much as people are making war, they're also making peace all the time, in a myriad ways. And I will tell you one short project that we did at the Center for Nonviolent Solutions, and that was, we created a walking tour of Worcester's peace history. And it's only 8 stops. We're not historians, although I take that back. My colleague who worked on that teaches American history, and she is a historian, so she did a lot of the research. But we walked people through 300 years, just touching down on events and individuals. And everybody who took the tour would say, I never knew this. I never knew about Elihu Burritt. I never knew that Quock Walker had challenged his enslavement. I never knew about the nonviolent rebellion in 1774 in Worcester. I never knew about the Republican senator, no less, who spoke up against discriminatory laws towards the Chinese, and really was a lone voice in the U.S. Senate for the rights of the forgotten and overlooked. So that, you see your war monuments, you see your memorials to times of great loss of human life and killing. What happens to us when we create monuments or tell histories that show, well, so people did this. They prevented slave catchers from coming into the city. They never came in again. They organically, collectively prevented a slave catcher from working in the city, and he never picked up a Black Worcesterite again. They never came back. And, that's saving a lot of people. And it does give, the implicit intention is to give a sense of our own power, our own nonviolent power, which we can use and we can explore together.
Thanks so much for that. And I wanted to share one of our attendees says here in the chat, my son plays chess with Russians on an app. He and those he plays with all wish for peace and talk about it all the time. So we know so many people on both sides of this war are just wishing for, praying for peace. They want it to come, and let's hope that it does happen in some way. And I want to thank you so much, Claire, for sharing your life as a peacemaker, your life as a journalist. And I want to thank our co-sponsors again, and Georgian Court University, Gwynedd Mercy, St. Joseph's, and University of Detroit Mercy for Mercy Universities. And Sisters of Mercy have nonviolence as one of their key social concerns. And we've learned a lot about nonviolent action this evening. And so I want to thank you so much for sharing all of that with us, Claire. And I want to thank everyone who came. You've been an attentive audience. I'm so glad you were able to join us as we discuss these issues this evening. So again, thank you, Claire. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Be sure to look at our website for CLASA, udmercy.edu/CLASA, CLASA. And you can see if we'll have any upcoming events. I'll be happy to let you know about that. So I hope you can join us on future events. Thank you also to Peace History Society, our co-sponsor. So thank you all for joining, and please have a good rest of your evening.
Thanks. Thank you, Gail. Thanks for letting me be with everybody tonight. God bless you all, and courage, and keep the peace.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, and good night.